This is the easiest and most efficient cactus farm in Minecraft. In this video I will show you how to build a 2-layer farm, but you can easily expand it and add as many layers as you want to improve efficiency. And these are the materials you need to build this farm. To improve efficiency. And these are the materials you need to build this farm.
This experience happened many years ago. I'm 23 now, but I grew up a scout. I started with the Cub Scouts, then transitioned to the Boy Scouts, and eventually earned the accomplishment of becoming an Eagle Scout. Throughout my years as a scout, I've been on countless campouts. Many friends came and went as kids quit the Scouts throughout the years. But one friend who stuck it through the whole way with me was Justin. Me and Justin were in the same grade, and we were close friends. At the time of this experience, we were both going to be entering 10th grade, 15 years old. As weird as it sounds, I honestly don't even remember what park we were camping out at. It was just too long ago. As soon as everybody had arrived, Scoutmaster Davis led the group on our hike to the campsite. After setting up our tents and having a quick snack, Scoutmaster Davis led us on another hike as the sun was starting to set. He liked to take us on hikes in the dark as he thought it taught good directional skills. On the way back, we had to use our flashlights since it was getting too dark. Mr. Davis played a little game to mess with the younger kids, acting like we were lost and they had to find the way back. He had one of the younger kids start to lead the way back, but the kid soon froze in his tracks and looked to Mr. Davis, claiming he heard something. Mr. Davis acted all forest rangery, stepping forward and making a listening motion. Me and Justin laughed out loud, and he shushed us. There was another sound, a very obvious step from a larger creature in the distance. Kids were shining their flashlights all over the place. Mr. Davis assured us it's okay as long as we make a lot of noise to keep any potential predators away. I gotta admit, it was a bit scary hearing him say that. Mr. Davis led the way back from there on out, but on several occasions, either me, Justin, or some other kid would point out steps coming from behind us. Clearly something was following us. Mr. Davis told us to just stay with the group and not to refrain from making noise. We got back to the campsite where we cooked a couple turkeys, popped open a few cans of corn, and then sat around the campfire where Mr. Davis began telling his famous stories. However, it was interrupted by footsteps circling around the campfire. Scouts started turning around, looking into the woods. Even the scoutmasters looked at each other. Assistant Scoutmaster Roberts hopped up, said, "Alright, this'll scare him off," and went for the gun in his tent. He pulled out his rifle and fired a shot into the air. We didn't hear any more footsteps after that. After a whole hour of listening to Mr. Davis's stories, scouts started heading to their tents. Me and Justin were in the same tent, and knowing how early the scoutmasters made us get up, we didn't really joke around for too long. The only sounds now were the crickets and the crackling of the fire outside. I fell asleep quickly, given how exhausted I was from all the hiking, but woke up to Justin nudging me. When my senses came to, I listened, and heard footsteps coming from outside the tent. The campfire was still lit outside, and it created a glow on the tent walls. But it also allowed us to see the shadow outline of what was outside. A person. I whispered, "So what, it's probably someone just going to take a piss." He told me to open the zipper and peek outside. I did what he said, and to my horror, there was some heavy-built man with a sack over his head and a ripped working shirt, very clearly holding a big knife. He was walking around some of the other tents. I zipped the opening back up and told Justin to be quiet. We had no phones or anything, so we couldn't call one of the scoutmasters. All we could do was wait. We couldn't tell if or when the man had left. We just sat there for what felt like hours, waiting, and eventually we fell asleep. We awoke to one of the
When that personalization happens, you are
scoutmasters blowing that stupid wake-up horn. Me and Justin were surprised that we even fell asleep given the situation, but we immediately went to go tell our scoutmasters what we saw. All three of them took our claims very seriously and wanted to make sure we weren't joking. They had no choice but to tell everyone to pack up and call their parents to get a ride home within 3 hours. Now this is the really weird part. Two of the younger kids in the group had their entire bags stolen, which mainly contained their clothing. When the scoutmasters went to investigate around their tents, we were all disturbed to see that there had been tiny holes carved into the tents, big enough for someone to look into. And that's exactly what the holes were for. The scoutmasters reported the incident to the town in which the park resides. It still horrifies me, given how real the situation was for me, that somebody literally followed us into the middle of the woods, spied on two 11 or 12-year-old kids while they slept, stole their clothes, and did whatever else. Thankfully, nobody was hurt, but the incident overall hurt the group, as some parents refused to allow their kids to go on any more campouts. It's sad that some sick people out there can really ruin things for a lot of other people. I'm a 15-year-old Boy Scout from Houston, Texas. My troop flew us out to Denver, Colorado, and we drove to a camp called Camp Alexander, about 45 minutes away from Colorado Springs. Me and 4 other people in our troop were participating in the high adventure program that the camp offers. This basically means that we were doing things like climbing mountains and white water rafting. 4 days into our trip and nothing has happened to us. We set up our tents next to the Arkansas River, as we would be rafting in it the next day. I sleep very poorly in sleeping bags, and had been waking up covered in sweat every night, and that night was no different. I woke up with my face in a puddle of drool and sweating all over my body. I checked my watch and it was around 3:45 a.m. I decided that it would be best for me to step out of my tent for a while and cool down. I put on a shirt and shorts and unzipped my tent. The way my tent was positioned, the opening was facing towards the river, and I immediately noticed that there was someone standing in the middle of the river facing downstream. The water was about waist high and 30 to 40 degrees Fahrenheit, and whoever was standing in there didn't have a shirt on, so I was extremely confused. After a moment of staring, I realized that I knew this person. He was my friend, who I'll be referring to as Dalton for privacy reasons. I called out for him 2 times before he finally moved. He looked right at me, and then he looked around as if he were processing the situation. He yelled at me, "What the fuck?" He ran back to the shore as fast as he could. I grabbed him a towel and shirt and asked him what the hell he was doing in the middle of the river at 4 in the morning. He answered saying that he didn't know and that he had just woken up to me yelling at him in the middle of the river. I don't know how he got there or if he sleepwalked or something like that, but it was seriously creepy. Nobody believed us in the morning and we just decided to forget about it. Dalton said he had never sleepwalked before or anything like that, so I have no idea why or how he would have gotten into that river. All I know is if I didn't wake up that night and get out of the tents, my friend Dalton might have been dead come morning time. This is going to be a brief, horrifying 100% true story of mine. I was 13 years old and one of the quieter kids in my Boy Scout troop. I'm not totally a shy person, but I couldn't really relate to any of the kids in my Boy Scout group. We were on our last campout of the 2008 camping season. It was in October and it was a little chilly, making our many hikes a little more bearable. This was the last campout of my life, and you'll soon know why. During one of our hikes, I was trailing behind the group as I usually did. I had this sudden urge to pee, so I let the group get a little further ahead and then went behind a tree. I almost had a heart attack as something made a heavy thud on the ground not too far away from me. It didn't sound like a stick or branch falling, it sounded like something putting its foot down into the leaves. I didn't know what to think. All I know is I was freaked out. I ran to catch up to the group. I had no idea what just happened, so I didn't want to tell anybody about it. I'll skip ahead to that night when I was trying to fall asleep. I had my own tent, as did some of the other kids in our tiny little troop, so I tried to go to sleep right away. A strange noise soon interrupted the silence, however. It sounded like breathing coming from a phone or something, and it seemed to be coming from inside my bag. After digging through my bag, I pulled out a big, heavy walkie-talkie. The only thing, I didn't bring or own that. Suddenly, in a deep, almost muffled voice, someone said into the walkie-talkie,
"I'm watching you, kid."
I pressed down the talk button and said, "Who is this?" One of the other kids were clearly pranking me. There was no response, only this sudden static. "Is this Mike?" There was silence. And then,
"I'm right outside your tent."
the fabric of the tent suddenly started pushing in on me as something from outside was pushing into it. I screamed like a baby, and that's when whoever was outside ran into the woods. 2 of my scoutmasters came rushing into the tent. I could barely even breathe, but I somehow managed to show them the walkie-talkie and explain what just happened. They lectured the kids for a few minutes, thinking it was one of them messing with me, but when I calmed down, I stepped in and told them that the voice was way too deep for it to have been any of them. We were all forced to share tents with 2 others that night, and the next day we packed up and moved to a nearby campsite with another Boy Scout troop. I really don't know what they did with the walkie-talkie. I was emotionally disturbed, embarrassed, and I just wanted to go home. I convinced my parents to let me quit Boy Scouts after that incident. It was by far the scariest experience of my life.
Working
It was August 11th, 2009. David Gimmelfarb told a park ranger that he wanted to do a nearly 3-kilometer loop hike on a trail called Las Pailas, located inside Rincón de la Vieja National Park. And ironically, that park ranger was the last known person to ever see David. Today I want to talk about a hiker who went out for what seemed like a simple short hike, but never came back. It has been 16 years now, and we still have no answers about what really happened. Now, whenever we go hiking or camping, our reasons are usually very simple. But sometimes, what starts as a peaceful escape can turn into something truly terrifying. David's full name was David Alexander Gimmelfarb, and he was 28 years old when he disappeared. And at the time, he was a graduate student working toward his doctorate in psychology at the Adler School of Professional Psychology in Chicago. But David was much more than just a student. He was someone who truly loved adventure and the outdoors, and he had plenty of experience to back it up. His friends and colleagues described him as incredibly intelligent, curious, and adventurous. On top of that, he was fluent in multiple languages, including Spanish and Russian, which made him very comfortable traveling to different parts of the world. David had hiked and explored nature, not just within the United States, but internationally as well. He was also a volunteer counselor at a community health center, which made his lifestyle quite demanding. He was constantly busy with work, and on top of that, his beloved grandmother had recently passed away, which left him feeling very stressed and emotionally drained. So he was looking for a place to hike, and one of his coworkers suggested Costa Rica. The idea immediately felt perfect to him. Since Spanish is the main language spoken in Costa Rica, he knew communication would not be a problem for him at all. One more thing worth mentioning here is that according to various reports, his parents described him as a bit of an introvert who was not very comfortable in social situations. And interestingly, this actually goes back to his childhood. David grew up speaking Russian at home, and when he started kindergarten, everyone around him spoke English. This language barrier made it difficult for him to communicate from a very early age. However, his friends also noted that as he grew older and made more friends, he gradually became more comfortable, and his introverted nature softened over time. He was also a passionate writer who loved writing about deep philosophical topics. And if you want to understand how David truly thought about life, one message he once wrote to a friend on Facebook says it all. Life is finite, and we must love it no matter what, so we can be satisfied with it when we look back on it. Now, this was not David's first hiking trip. He had done this many times before. In fact, just a year before heading to Costa Rica, he had gone on a similar hiking trip in Hawaii. So he was no stranger to this kind of adventure. David's Costa Rica trip began on August 9th, 2009, and since David was an only child, he always made sure to regularly update his mother about where he was and what he was doing, no matter where he traveled. So as usual, David called his mother that day and talked to her about everything that had happened throughout the day. During the conversation, he mentioned that he had met a girl at the beach that day, and when his mother asked what she was like, David simply said, "She seemed very nice." She was actually quite happy to hear this, as David was single, and she thought it could be a good opportunity for him. She then asked what his plans were for the next day, and David told her that was planning to start his main hike the next morning, and also mentioned that the hiking trail was quite far from where he was staying, so he would need to drive there. They talked for a little while longer, and then he hung up. That was the last conversation his mother ever had with him. In the morning on August 11th, David got up early and made his way to Rincón de la Vieja National Park. Upon arriving, he registered his entry at the park, and his arrival was officially recorded by a park ranger at 10 a.m. Now, before starting his hike, David told the park ranger about his plans for the trail and then left. But ironically, that park ranger was the last person to ever see David and speak to him. That same evening on August 11th, When David did not call his mother at his usual time, she began to worry. David always called her regularly and had a fixed time to do so. When that time passed and there was still no call, she grew concerned. And by 10 p.m., when she still had not heard from him, she tried calling his phone directly but got no answer. She then called the hotel and explained the situation to the staff, telling them that David had gone hiking that morning and was supposed to be back by the evening, but she feared he hadn't returned, so she asked the staff to check his room. A little while later, the hotel staff called her back and told her that David had not returned to his room. His suitcase was still there, but his rental car was nowhere to be found at the hotel. Since David's mother had already told the staff where David had gone, they contacted the national park and found out that his rental car was still sitting in the park's parking lot. This made it clear that David had not returned from his hike. After hearing all of this, David's mother was extremely worried. And by August 13th, just one day after, his mother and father had arrived and made their way directly to the national park, where they found that the search for David was already underway. They then went straight to David's hotel, where the hotel manager opened his room, room number 16. When they walked in, it was clear that the room had already been searched. The bed was completely untouched, as if no one had slept in it. And right beside the bed was David's suitcase. They then opened the safe box in the room, where the hotel guests normally keep their valuables, and inside they found David's passport, his phone, and $600 in cash. But here is something that stood out as suspicious. Whenever we go hiking, we usually carry our phone with us, without even thinking about it. It is almost essential. Yet David had left his phone behind in the room. The passport and the cash make sense to leave behind for security reasons. But leaving his phone behind is something that does not quite add up. When David's mother looked through the rest of the room, she noticed that a few things were missing. A backpack, his wallet, which contained his driving license and credit card, and possibly a few other small items. She believed that David had most likely taken these things with him on the hike. Now, at first, David's mother's initial thought was that David had perhaps gotten injured during the hike, and that was why he hadn't returned on time. Or maybe he was somewhere in the forest and just needed to be found. Now, this was not the first time someone had gone missing at Rincón de la Vieja National Park. Hikers occasionally lose their way in this park, and there are several reasons for that. The park contains volcanic craters, boiling mud pots, and sulfur springs, which can sometimes block trails and force hikers to change their route. These conditions can also lead to injuries. As for dangerous animals, jaguars do live in the park, but sightings are extremely rare, so that was not a major concern. Another important thing to note is that this national park is massive, covering over 14,000 hectares. That is an enormous area, and getting lost in a place that large is not entirely surprising. The search began immediately, but nothing was found. The experienced park rangers had two possibilities in mind. The first, as I mentioned earlier, was that David had gotten injured somewhere and was stuck in the forest. The second possibility was that David had decided to take a more difficult route, one that passed right alongside the volcano. It was possible that David was drawn to the idea of getting a closer look at the volcano and had followed that harder trail instead. If the second possibility was correct, then that difficult route would take a minimum of 8 to 9 hours to complete. If David started his hike at 10 a.m., even taking just 8 hours, he would not have finished until well past 6 p.m., meaning he would have been out there well after sunset. It was possible that he had gotten stuck somewhere in the dark, which is why they couldn't find him, and that was their initial thinking. So when the ground search came up empty, they brought in a helicopter to search from above. The park ranger, who was the last person to see David, was also on board the helicopter, which made it easier to identify him if spotted. But despite all of this, David was nowhere to be found. As time went on, David's mother grew more and more worried. So in the morning, she went directly to the U.S. Embassy and explained the entire situation. But unfortunately, she did not receive much of a response from them. Meanwhile, back in the United States, David's friends took matters into their own hands. They created a Facebook group called Help Find David Gimmelfarb, and the response was remarkable. Thousands of people joined the group in an effort to help find David. His friends also took to the streets across the U.S., standing outside restaurants and shopping malls holding signs, trying to attract media attention in hopes of getting more government support involved in the search. And their efforts paid off. On August 19th, the U.S. Embassy sent 2 military helicopters equipped with heat sensors to search the forest. Heat sensors are far more effective than the naked eye because they can detect any heat movement within the forest, even in dense areas that are impossible to see from above. The search continued for 3 consecutive days, but even then, there was still no sign of David. Now the darker possibilities were starting to take over. The park rangers believed there were 3 possible things that could have happened to David. First, he may have been attacked by an animal. Second, he may have somehow fallen into one of the active volcanoes located near the trail where he was hiking. And third, something that I hadn't mentioned earlier about the park, there were reportedly some illegal activities that took place inside the park, and unfortunately David may have crossed paths with the wrong people. And out of these 3, the animal attack theory was quickly ruled out. Because if an animal had attacked him, his body would have at least been found somewhere. The volcano theory still held some possibility, but since the area around the volcanoes had already been searched, no one could say for certain. As for the illegal activity theory, I have not been able to find any concrete reports to support that either. Now, from David's mother's perspective, she held on to the belief that David was still alive. She thought that maybe he had simply gotten lost, or perhaps because he had been under a lot of stress and grief following his grandmother's death. He may have suffered some kind of mental breakdown and lost his way. And while it is true that David was going through a difficult time emotionally, the chances of that alone being the reason he could not be found seemed quite unlikely. When no new clues were coming in, David's parents offered a reward of $10,000 for any information about him. Along with his current photo, they also published a computer-generated image showing what David might look like with a beard and longer hair. This actually brought in some results, as a tip came in from a farmer who claimed to have seen someone matching David's description in the forest. Since the case had already been going on for quite some time, David's parents hired a professional dog handler from Virginia, who arrived in Costa Rica toward the end of September. They went to the area where the farmer had reported seeing David. And when the dogs were given the scent of David's old clothing, they did pick up a faint trail, but they showed very little interest in the exact spot where the farmer claimed to have seen him. As time went on, darker possibilities began to creep into David's parents' minds as well. Although they refused to accept the worst, they started to wonder whether David was perhaps alive, but had become a victim of robbery, and was being held somewhere against his will. Years passed with no new clues. In fact, even 4 years after David's disappearance, it was reported that at least 8 foreigners had gone missing in Costa Rica. Then around 2013, David's parents suddenly started receiving numerous phone calls and emails claiming that David was being held hostage. This seemed like a new lead, but when the investigators asked for proof and requested a photo, the image that was sent was so dark that it was nearly impossible to identify anyone in it. The investigators did not take it seriously, believing it was just a random person making false claims. And they were right. It turned out to be completely false. Then, almost 9 years after David's disappearance, another tip came in claiming that David had been admitted to a national psychiatric hospital. But when they went to check, it was not David. It was incredibly frustrating because almost every piece of information they were receiving turned out to be wrong. The case was then handed over to the Criminal Investigation Department in San Jose, where 2 investigators, R and L, continued the search. But by this point, 10 years had passed since David disappeared. They went back and reviewed all the old leads from the beginning, but still found nothing new. But even now, after almost 17 years, David Gimmelfarb has never been found, and the case remains unsolved. Now let me share my own analysis of this case from the very beginning to the end, and tell you what I personally think may have happened. Let's start with August 10th, 2009, the last day David spoke to his mother. From what I have read and understood, during that phone call he mentioned a girl he had met at the beach that day. Now he said he quite liked her, and this opens up an interesting possibility. Could this girl somehow be connected to what happened on the trail in the morning? Or maybe when David started his hike at 10 a.m., he ran into her again, and perhaps she was connected to some kind of robbery, and things went wrong from there. This is a possibility we simply cannot ignore. Now let's move on to the second possibility, which begins with the search itself. Despite all the efforts from David's mother, his friends, and even the 2 American military helicopters equipped with heat sensors, David was nowhere to be found. This tells us something very clearly. During those 3 days of searching, David was most likely not in that forest at all, because the chances of a living person being in a forest and not being detected by heat sensors are extremely low. Another possibility is that David may have somehow fallen into the volcano, and this is not something we can take lightly either. Now the third possibility is that David may have disappeared on his own free will, but personally I think this is very unlikely. If we look at what was left in his room, his suitcase was still there, $600 in cash was in the safe box, and his passport was there too. If he had planned to disappear voluntarily, he would have taken these things with him. On top of that, his mother did not notice anything unusual in his voice or behavior during their last phone call, so the possibility of David disappearing by choice seems very low. Now the fourth possibility involves the farmer who claimed to have seen David. I personally think there might be something to this. Maybe when David was hiking, he somehow lost his way and ended up in an area where the farmer spotted him. But since the farmer never stopped him or spoke to him, David moved on before anyone could reach him. And after that, something may have happened to him that is the reason we cannot find him today. As for the remaining possibilities, such as the ransom claim where someone said they were holding David hostage, or the claim that David had been admitted to a psychiatric hospital, I personally do not think these hold much weight. It seems like those people were simply looking for attention rather than providing any genuine information. Now let me talk about what I find the most suspicious detail in this entire case is why David didn't take his phone with him on the hike. I couldn't find any reports mentioning whether he took his phone on his previous hike in Hawaii, but the point is this. When anyone goes hiking, there are certain essential things they carry, but a mobile phone is arguably one of the most important things to have, especially in an unfamiliar place. And no matter how much I think about it from every angle, I simply cannot find a reasonable explanation for it. I would love to know your thoughts, so make sure to let me know in the comments below. I will be back soon with another interesting and mysterious real story, just like this one.
It was a week or two before Christmas, about 3 years ago. I lived alone in a single-family home, and living in the north, winters get pretty brutal here. I was glad to be off work this day, because the blizzard that came through was wild. Almost 3 feet of snow. I stayed in all day, of course. It got even worse at night. but I was cozy and I ended up just grabbing a few blankets and falling asleep on the couch downstairs while watching TV and listening to the wind outside. I slept like a rock for a couple of hours, a good 2 or 3 I'd say, before I jolted awake. I was really confused for a second because I felt like I heard light knocking, but also felt like it was part of a dream I was having. Now that I was fully awake though, I didn't hear anything. I brushed it off and sat up, figuring I should probably just head upstairs while I was up. I shut everything off and walked toward the stairs, but as I passed by the front door, I got this feeling that I should check just in case. I looked out the peephole at first, but it was blocked by snow or ice, so then I opened the door. No one was there. However, in the thick snow were clear signs someone had been there. Because the snow was so tall, there weren't distinct footprints, but you could tell someone had dragged their legs all the way up here, and right up to the door, and probably took the same way to leave. The conditions were full-on whiteout, so past 5 feet from the porch, I couldn't see a thing, not even the road at the end of the driveway. If someone was still out there, and had just left moments ago, I didn't have a clue. I closed and locked the door. I felt really uncomfortable about it, but I think my first thought was that whoever it was might have been lost in the weather, and going door to door to try and get help. Why else would anyone be out there in the middle of the night? And because they were gone, I figured they just moved on to the next home. I didn't know what else to really think or do about it. I went upstairs and got in bed. Took a bit to get myself to fall asleep, and this time I didn't wake up abruptly. However, the way I woke up was really strange. I was freezing. Like full-on shivering, and it was so cold in the house that I could see my breath. I actually whispered what the hell under my breath because it didn't make any sense. My room was dark, but all the windows were closed, and obviously I'd had the heat on in the house all day and never touched it. Something had to be wrong. I checked the time and saw it was only 2 hours after I'd gone to bed. I got up and walked into the hallway. It was just as cold. I knew it was below 0 outside, and I swear it had to be around 20 degrees inside, so it was painfully cold. I think I'd heard too many horror stories, because as I walked downstairs, I half expected to find the front door wide open, and wet shoe prints all over the house. But I didn't. It was closed, and there were no signs of anyone breaking in. I hurried to the thermostat that was right in the front hallway. I stared at it for a moment. The physical dial was set to off, which I was 100% sure I didn't do, but also the screen wouldn't even turn on. Every possibility ran through my head in that moment. I just couldn't understand that if this was an intruder, where were they? And why mess with the thermostat? I was scared, and really wasn't sure if I should check the house or call the cops. I know it sounds silly, but I knew if I called the cops and it turned out no one else was here, I'd look insane. I decided to at least go back upstairs to get my phone. I quickly started walking to the stairs, and just when I got to the bottom, I heard a sound behind me. I knew that exact sound the instant I heard it. It was the couch. It always made that same squeaking sound anytime you moved on it. I froze, then turned around. I took a couple steps, just enough so I could lean my body around the corner and look into the living room. What I saw was the most disturbing image that I still can't get out of my head. There was a man sitting right on the couch, facing forward, but his head was turned and looking at me. It was dark, but his eyes were wide and lifeless, and he was smiling. Not some over-the-top, teethy grin, but just enough to know this guy was crazy. He didn't really react to seeing me either. He stayed sitting and looking at me, not saying anything or even so much as blinking, just holding a stare. I honestly can't even remember how long I stood there in absolute terror before I ran upstairs. I got on the phone with the police immediately and locked myself in the bedroom. Only 30 seconds later, I started hearing footsteps coming up the stairs, then down the hallway. I saw his shadow move right behind the door. He knocked 3 times on the door, very slowly, like he was taunting me. Then he walked back toward the stairs, and I couldn't hear anything after that. What was so terrifying was this guy clearly wasn't normal, so I had no idea what he was going to do next. I stayed locked up in my room, waiting and freezing, for almost 20 minutes before the police made it, and the guy was already gone. There were no more tracks in the snow, so it looked like he probably left out the front door, which is also where the police think he got in from. I didn't remember whether or not I'd used the bolt lock. I know I used the main door lock on the handle, but if that was the case, police seem to think he picked the lock to get in. To me, this feels hard to believe, though. He didn't look like he was mentally well enough to be capable of picking a lock, but maybe it's easier than I think. I don't know what insane plan he had next, or why he was acting the way he was. From his smile, the whole thermostat thing, and even the knocks on my door, it's even more creepy and disturbing, knowing he was basically playing with me. I hope it was just some freak, unlucky incident that never comes to anything else. But I'll probably never stop losing sleep over the unsettling look on his face when I found him sitting on the couch. This was in 2013. I lived alone with my dog Amber in a forested neighborhood with small, quiet homes. Amber was a large husky with amber eyes, hence the name. And being a husky, we went for a lot of walks in the winter. This night, after getting home from work at 9, I immediately got her leash and took her out for a walk on the trail behind the house. It was a trail that went behind the neighborhood, through the woods, and connected a bunch of parks together. It was kind of like a forest preserve trail. There was a good amount of snow on the ground, but Amber loved it, so I toughed it out. It was nice and quiet outside that night, the sort of quiet you only get in the winter because no one else was out. We got a half-mile in, so maybe 10 minutes into the walk, when Amber suddenly stopped, perked her head up for a second, then turned around. At first, I thought she was looking at me, but then I saw her eyes were actually looking past me. I turned and looked over my shoulder. There was nothing behind me. The trail was empty, and the woods were silent and pitch black in every direction. I tried to ask Amber if she was okay, and even walked past her and pulled on the leash a bit. She kept her eyes locked on the path behind us, but eventually, with enough convincing, she started walking again. I kept checking over my shoulders and never saw a thing, so I figured it was just one of those times a dog hears or sees something and fixates on it, even though it's nothing. She was a smart dog, don't get me wrong, but she always had her strange moments. We finished the trail and headed back on the neighborhood street. The rest of that walk, she wasn't as energetic, so whatever she thought she saw or heard, she really didn't like. Once inside, though, she was back to normal. I fed her and started making dinner for myself. I just threw some leftovers in the microwave. Only 10-ish minutes after getting back from the walk, though, Amber all of a sudden started howling, which she usually does when she's scared. She was in the living room, so I ran in there and found her howling at the window. I hushed her and walked up to the window. The blinds weren't down, so I could see outside, and didn't see anything. But after a bit, I noticed that most of the window was frosted over, except for the one spot I was looking through. It looked like the frost had melted off that part, as if someone was breathing close to the glass, looking inside. Once I realized that, I quickly pulled the blinds down. I calmed down Amber and stood there in the living room trying to make sense of it. I had no way to know for sure, but with her barking and not really knowing any other way the frost would have melted like that, it seemed pretty likely someone had been there. I went around the house and checked the other windows, but didn't see any other signs of anyone creeping around. I was pretty weirded out, though having Amber on watch for me helped keep me much calmer and less scared about it, for better or for worse. If I were alone, I'd probably have thought about calling the cops, but it really didn't even cross my mind. I ate my dinner and turned on a movie to wind down for the night. I can't remember if I'd finished the movie and had started something else, or if it was toward the end of it, but I know at least an hour, maybe 2, had gone by. Amber was sleeping with her head resting on my lap, so when she suddenly lifted her head, I looked down and saw her eyes open and looking to my right. I only had a second to turn and see that she was looking at the front door before there were sudden loud knocks against it. Both me and Amber jumped up from the couch, but I quieted her down so I could listen. Whoever was outside must have heard me though, because as soon as Amber stopped barking, he called out, "Anyone home? Could you answer the door and help me out for a moment?" I didn't recognize his voice at all, and in the few seconds I took thinking of how to respond, he called out again. "I heard you in there. I know you're listening. I just need some help with directions. I'm not from here, and it's real cold out here." The way he just tried to explain his whole situation through the door without me having answered yet was really creepy to me, and something in his voice didn't sound genuine. So I stayed quiet, hoping he'd realize I was just going to ignore him and would just leave. There was a longer pause this time, maybe 20 seconds, before he slammed his fist against the door. "You're a real piece of shit. I'm sure this'll come back around." His voice was eerily monotone when he said that, and I wasn't sure what to make of that last line. It sounded like a slight threat. I heard his footsteps leave the porch and walk away. After I thought he was far enough, I hurried to the window and looked out, but I couldn't see him. I contemplated calling the cops for 30 minutes. It was one of those situations where I felt it was justified to call, but also there wasn't anything anyone could do now that the man was gone. So I ended up deciding on a middle ground of putting in a report through a call on the non-emergency line. That way they could have the incident on file, if anything were to happen. After getting off the phone, I was wide awake and knew I wouldn't be able to sleep for a while. So I sat back down and continued to watch TV, volume lowered so I could listen if he came back. And sure enough, 40 minutes later, I noticed a light moving through the blinds, followed by the sound of a car coming down the road outside. And once the sound got louder and the light got closer, it suddenly shut off. I listened to the car continue slowly rolling up and stop right outside my house. I stayed on the couch and waited for a minute, listening and praying that this was someone else, and that at any point they were going to leave. But after a while passed, I got up and bent one of the blinds down, just slightly enough to look outside. There was an old, either black or gray car parked right on the curb, headlights off, and no movement in or around it. I must have stared at the car for an entire minute, waiting to see someone get out or something, when I heard a dull click sound on the other end of the house, and half a second later, everything shut off around me. The whole house went dark. Someone had cut the power. I didn't hesitate this time to get on the phone with the cops. Within 15 seconds, the person outside started banging on the door, hitting it non-stop angrily. Some of the hits sounded heavier, even shaking the house. I was sure this was the same guy from before. I told the operator what I could, and looked back out the window to describe the car that was parked outside. As I did, the knocking stopped and footsteps rushed toward the window. I pulled back and let the blinds close. He stood outside the window for a bit, like he was waiting for me to look out again. I continued whispering to the operator on the phone. Meanwhile, Amber had been barking and whimpering the entire time. And I realized after a minute that I hadn't heard anything else. It was just Amber barking. I waited 3 or 4 minutes until the operator told me an officer was 30 seconds away before looking out the window again. Footprints led away from the window, through the snow into where the car was parked before. It was gone now. Having an officer there was a huge relief, and he looked around and noted everything that happened, but that really was it. There was nothing else to do. For weeks, even months after that night, there was this lingering feeling that the man was still out there, having some sort of vendetta against me. I just keep thinking on everything that happened that night, all the way back to Amber seeing or hearing something on the path behind us. I genuinely feel like that man had been stalking me the entire night. Knowing how likely unstable and creepy this guy was, I don't think it's far off to assume that if I'd opened the door, or not had Amber with me on that walk, and was entirely alone, I could have gone missing and never been seen again.
He promised to make America healthier. Instead, RFK Jr. gutted the FDA, undermining food and medicine safety. And outbreaks of measles and whooping cough are on the rise.
I don't think people should be taking advice, medical advice, from me.
No kidding. RFK Jr.'s conspiracy theories endanger us all. And while he makes us sicker, Congressman Scott Perry has stood silent. Tell Congressman Perry, do your job and stand up for us.
I worked at a local gas station, usually night shifts. I'd been there for over 6 years. Of all the craziness and strange characters and things I'd seen throughout my time working there, nothing even compares to what happened a few months ago. Just for a reference of the place I worked at, it's a gas station that I'd describe as being on the outskirts of the city. Not necessarily remote, but past the gas station, there was nothing for a good 20 miles. It was the place people stopped at to fill up right when entering or just before leaving town. This was in the beginning of winter, and this night it was snowing a decent amount. enough to keep most folks home, but truckers and whatnot would still be coming through. Nothing about this night was out of the usual for the first couple of hours. I stayed behind the counter, saving all the other work for later, when I knew it'd be dead. Around 1 a.m., I got a call on the store phone. We almost never get calls, especially overnight. The only calls I'd sometimes get were from my manager to let me know something he forgot to tell me just a few minutes after he left. I saw this was from an unknown number. I picked it up and asked if I could help them. While I was talking, and for a few seconds afterward, I heard a man talking in the background, and the audio kept cutting out too, like when wind is hitting the microphone. Hello, anyone there? This time, no one spoke. I knew it wasn't dead though, because I could still hear the mic crackling. After a few more seconds, I hung up. It didn't feel like a prank call, but it also didn't feel like an accidental dial. Someone was on the other end, just listening. I didn't think too hard about it. 10 minutes later, I'd pretty much forgotten it happened. Starting to feel bored, and seeing the snow was starting to stack up, I threw my coat on and rolled the maintenance cart out to the gas pumps to do all the cleaning and everything before it got too bad out. It was cold and icy out, and the wind only seemed to be picking up. As I was moving between each of the pumps, I felt really uneasy. Something about how quiet and dark it was out there had me feeling off. Kinda like every time I was doing something, it felt like something was behind me. Usually being out there at night didn't bother me, so the fact I was feeling strange this night was really odd. I remember being aware of how uneasy I was, and thinking in the moment how in all 6 years I'd worked there, this was the one time I'd felt this way, without any reason, which then made me think there had to be a reason. I looked around. The roads were empty, and even the town, as far as I could see, looked asleep and quiet. I finished doing what I was doing and hurried up and got back inside, warming up and scratching my head at what just happened out there. As soon as I was inside, though, the feeling went away. I thought maybe I was just tired, so I grabbed an iced coffee from the fridge and sipped on it to wake myself up. It was weirdly dead for the next hour. I think it was 2 a.m., so of course it was always dead around this time, but not seeing a single car or truck come through was weird. I started the rest of the work stuff that I had to get done, mostly stocking and reorganizing a bunch of shelves to prep for a delivery in the morning. While stocking, the phone started ringing again. I took a second, then started walking over to the counter, but just before I picked up, the call dropped. I stood there and looked at the phone for a minute, really confused. My mind instantly thought back to the first phone call from an hour ago. I tried to shake it off again and get back to work, walking back to the aisle, but as I passed by the front doors, I saw someone outside. He was far back, walking through the snow toward the building. I couldn't tell which direction he came from, but he was definitely heading in here. 30 seconds later, he walked in. I looked up from the shelf and greeted him, but stuttered halfway through when I saw his face. He looked at me with dead eyes and a narrow frown. He did not look friendly at all. The guy was pretty big too, 6 foot something with broad shoulders, and just overall an intimidating appearance. I moved from the aisle back to the counter. The man didn't speak, but made his way through the shop, sort of snaking through the aisles very slowly. He was looking at the stuff on the shelves, but it was almost like he wasn't really looking for anything. And as I watched him, I got this weird feeling that he wasn't alone. I kept checking out the windows, looking at the dark, snowy parking lot, and almost waiting for someone else to appear. The longer this went on, the more uneasy I felt. Best way I can explain the feeling was like my body knew this was the calm before the storm. Everything felt even quieter, too. My whole body felt like it was preparing for something to happen. And then, suddenly, something shifted. The man was looking over the shelves at me, and this time, when I made eye contact, he didn't look away. He held his gaze. After a moment, I looked away, moving my eyes toward the window, and immediately noticed someone out there. I only caught a glimpse of them, moving right past the window and around to the side of the building. I looked back at the man inside. He was still staring at me, and although he didn't say anything, his eyes were telling me to not move or do anything. I was sure if I even tried to pick up the phone, or tried to run, this guy would pull out a weapon and stop me. Not a minute later, I heard a thump on the back door, followed by a few more, and then a heavy metal cracking sound. The other guy had broken into the back of the building. Now, even in the moment, I was really confused. He wasn't being sneaky by bashing down the door, so why didn't he just walk in through the front of the building? The man in front of me was still staring at me, while the other was rummaging through something in the back room for a while. Then he appeared in the doorway. He looked furious, glaring at me, and then glaring at the other guy. Oddly, he didn't enter the main shopping area, though. He stayed right in the doorway. But as soon as the other guy saw him, he essentially charged toward me. I muttered whatever helpless words I could to try to de-escalate, but the guy grabbed me and basically dragged me into the back room. Both of these dudes were way bigger than I was, and probably armed, so I had no chance at fighting. When we got to the back room, everything was ransacked, but the men didn't stop there. They dragged me out the door. By this point, both of them were holding on to me and forcing me across the back of the building until we got to the edge of the parking lot. Beyond that point was a field of scattered trees, and really nothing else. I was still trying to plead with them, but it was like they couldn't even hear me. Whatever they were doing, they'd already made up their minds on. This was all planned. They forced me through the snow far away from the gas station. I mean, probably a quarter mile through the deep snow, to where I couldn't even see the building anymore. We were just in the middle of the trees. Then, suddenly, they tossed me on the ground, my face planted in the snow, and I waited in horror. I was scared to turn around, thinking I'd be looking into the barrel of a gun. But after a few seconds, I heard them take a few footsteps and started walking away. I still didn't trust it. I waited a whole minute before looking behind me. They were gone. I stayed there for a few minutes, knowing I couldn't just run up behind them, but also I was freezing. It was around 10 degrees outside, and I didn't have my coat on, or snow boots, or gloves. I think they really did leave me out there to die. Eventually, the cold was so numbingly painful that I had to run back. I followed the tracks from the men all the way back to the gas station, and with no signs of them outside, I quietly got close up to the building. I couldn't hear anything inside. I wrapped around to the front and saw through the windows that no one was in there, and finally ran in and called the police. Thinking on how planned everything felt by the two men, I was sure that even with a description of them, neither would be found. But the cops actually did find one of them, the one that came into the shop. The security cameras had a good enough view of his face to get an identity. However, the other guy never stepped foot in that area of the building. He stayed in the back, where there weren't any cameras. And this one guy that they did find didn't speak a word about his accomplice. In fact, he basically said nothing at all as to what they were doing. And even stranger is that nothing of value was really missing. The obvious stuff, like the cash in the register, was still there. With the entire back room ransacked, though, the guy was definitely looking for something. Something specific that he probably found and got away with. To put a bow on top of this whole thing, I asked my manager, who is the owner of the gas station, about why he thinks they broke in and what they were looking for. But he started acting really weird after that, straight up asking why I was even asking that, as if I didn't just go through a whole ordeal and almost lose my life because of it. And a few weeks later, I woke up to a call from him firing me. I was given severance pay and everything, so it was all technically legal, but extremely suspicious. After working there and knowing him for 6 years, suddenly cutting me off after a simple question was odd to say the least. Something else was going on there that I wasn't aware of, and I think he didn't like that I was trying to figure it out. Honestly though, I just feel lucky to be alive after that.